In the early 90s, Mazda debuted what would eventually become one of the most popular sports cars ever, the Miata. Manual, rear-wheel drive, and handling that can compete with sports cars double the price. As car enthusiasts, we love to push the boundaries and improve our car's performance in any way possible. The Miata is known to be slightly underpowered. Okay, it's slow as f**k, pardon my French. If your car is also slow, here is an overview of what it takes to turbo a car the right way. I also upgraded my clutch, which I didn't put in this video, but keep in mind it is a necessary modification if you want to get all the power to the ground when you're done. Okay. Enjoy. Disconnect the battery, drain the coolant, and drain the oil. Remove the stock intake system, which only has a few clamps and bolts holding it in place. Remove the exhaust heat shield, then soak the manifold hardware in some penetrating oil. Once the exhaust manifold was removed, I moved on to the radiator. Disconnect the fans, remove the upper and lower hose, unbolt the radiator stays, and out she comes. The compressor housing of the turbo comes very close to contacting the frame rail. You have to cut 2 slits, then hammer the metal downwards to make space. I then used some red paint to protect the metal once I was done. Now, moving on to the good stuff. Let's assemble this turbo. Install the oil feed fitting on top of the turbo. Make sure it's snug, but do not over tighten. Install the wastegate actuator and make sure it still has a full range of motion. Lastly, install this small brass nipple on the compressor housing. The exhaust manifold studs need to be torqued down, and you can do so by utilizing the double nut method. Thread down 2 nuts and jam them against each other in order to apply torque to the studs. You can then bolt down the turbo. I followed the same exact double nut method for the studs going into the hot side of the turbo. I then bolted on the first piece of the downpipe. Now it's time to install the turbo. I had to loosen up the driver's side motor mount and jack up the engine to make space for the turbo assembly, also while prying on the engine towards the passenger side. After some effort, the turbo was in and torqued down, ready for its new home. For right now, I'm going to finish off the exhaust side portion going down. So the downpipe's broken up into 2 sections, which I'll show you right over here. We need to use the OEM O2 sensor. I'm going to get this guy all in ready to go. Right at the back of the turbo here, it's a perfect 90-degree that goes down. There's already 4 studs pointing down, and we're going to come in here through the tire well. You might be able to see it. Actually getting those 4 nuts on, and then there's a second piece that simply slips on the end of this portion of the downpipe right here. So this guy will simply slip on, and they also give you an extra bung if you have a wideband, which I'll eventually do, but for right now, they also give you a plug, so we'll get that in there as well. Now it's time to plumb the turbo. For the feed line, I teed in to where the OEM oil pressure sensor is located, which in this case is on the passenger side of the block. After removing the sensor, I used a brass T to screw into the block, and now I had 2 ports to use. One for the OEM pressure sensor, and one for the oil feed line going to the turbo. Now for the return line, I had to measure about 2 inches down from the top flange of the oil pan. After marking the spot, I used a center punch, then began to drill my pilot hole. Then I used this 3764 strobit, which is the exact size that I needed for my 3/8 MPT tap. Tapping the oil pan can be a bit scary. Just take your time and don't rush this process. I made sure to pack not only my drill bits, but also my tap with grease to make sure I caught any shavings before they had fallen in. But for any shavings that may have ended up in the pan, this is what Flying Miata has you do. Use some leftover hose and a funnel to pour a generous amount of mineral spirits in to thoroughly clean everything else out. I then threaded my hose barb into the pan and attached the return line running down from the turbo to it. Now let's move on to the cold side of the system. Installing the cold side of the turbo kit should be pretty self-explanatory, probably one of the easiest. I just had to push a few brackets out of the way, meaning like some power steering lines on my NB to make room for this guy. All this needs, it actually utilizes some of the factory hardware. So all you need is a simple bracket, and it even says on the bracket with AC, no AC, just so you know which holes to use. This is going to attach here. I'm going to get a couple of these brackets here. And then these holes line up directly with the holes on the hood latch. That's how it's mounted up. And then the lines, this will run directly to the cold side of the turbo where the compressed air will come out. And this is the side with the bypass valve, which this will run directly to the throttle body. Some tips for installing the cold side of the turbo system. The intercooler pipe on the driver's side running to the cold side of the turbo was quite difficult to install. I used some soapy water to lubricate the outside of the hose to make it easier to slide into place. Also, trimming the splash guards is necessary to fit around the intercooler pipes. Once I was happy with the fit, I clamped them down and moved on to the intake system. This was as simple as slipping on the turbo inlet and the stock MAF sensor I took from the old intake. I clamped those in place, and then to finish things off, the new intake filter and intake air temp sensor were installed into the new box. Finally looking like a turbo kit now. All right, we're almost done. Although a timing belt and water pump are not required for this turbo kit, I'd highly recommend getting it done while you're in there. I did a timing belt, water pump, front crank seal, both cam seals, and new accessory belts. I'd also recommend getting special tools for the job to help get it done right, like this cam and crank holder tool and specialized seal install tools. It just gives you the peace of mind when the job is done right. I also did a coolant reroute on this Miata, which helps dissipate the heat much better. Also, it does clean up the front of the engine by deleting the front water neck. Before installing the accessory belts, I installed my new adjustable timing wheel. This is a vital piece to the system as it is required for me to retard the timing by 6 degrees. The added boost pressure with the stock timing setup would result in the engine knocking. The other piece to this puzzle, of course, is the tune aspect. With this kit in particular, I will be running a piggyback tune. Flying Miata calls it the Voodoo Box. The box only has a few wires you need to connect. One wire for each injector, one wire for power, one wire for ground, and the other for the O2 sensor. And lastly, a vacuum line that is of course routed to the intake manifold. It takes the input from the O2 sensor and the vacuum line to deliver the proper amount of fuel now that we have more air. This is not the optimal way to tune a car, but with going this route, I can actually stay smog legal as I do live in California. Soon, I will transfer over to a standalone ECU when this does become a dedicated track car. But for now, this is what we're doing. Now we're on the final stretch. I installed my upgraded radiator and wired up my new fans, installed new spark plugs, and set the gap to 28 thousandths. Put fresh oil in the car, then began to fill the cooling system. Now listen up, you cannot forget this step. You need to prime the oil system. Disable the car from starting by pulling this relay. Now you can crank the car over in multiple 5 to 8 second cycles with a small break in between. After a few cycles, you will begin to see the oil pressure begin to rise. Crank a few more times after that to ensure proper oiling to your turbo. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Don't mind the booty shorts and the mic is an absolute mess. This is the first start of the Miata. I am nervous. We got a whole crowd. Show the crowd. Show the crowd. There he is. There he is. Brandon, look, making an appearance. I'm nervous. I'm just saying more shit. I don't have to do it. But okay, we already cranked it. We primed the system. We're ready to go. We're going to go for it. And then we got to bleed right away. So if it explodes, like, I tried. You know, my hardest. You know what I'm saying? Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Sounds like a little bit of an exhaust leak. Well, it currently runs, you know what I'm saying? Like, we got something, you know what I'm saying? We got something. Sounds a little better, you know what I mean? Slight exhaust leak, but I mean, hey, it's still running, you know? So right now what we're doing is we're listening for any sounds. We're trying to bleed the cooling system all at the same time, making sure there's no leaks. So far, so good. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen, the first drive. We got an audience in the crowd, you know what I'm saying? Here we go. We're hyped. I'm excited. We're going to get straight into it. I'm going to start it up, go for the first Maiden Voyage. We're going to cross our fingers. Hope everything's good. That was only like 3,000 RPM. You heard a little shoo. So, I mean, I'm hyped on it. I think that's gonna be it. The next video, we will get real driving through the mountains. It's gonna be amazing. Huge shout out to the boys, you know what I'm saying, behind the camera. Came through at the end. Hope you guys enjoyed. We'll catch you on the next one.